As we now begin our look at Linux basics, we're going to examine some common commands and ways that we navigate and manipulate the file system. The first place we want to start is with the sudo command. We're inside of our terminal emulator here, and you can see that our current username is Kali. We see that listed inside of our terminal. That's the default account when we downloaded this VM. If you remember, username Kali, password Kali. In previous versions of Kali, the default account used during login was something called the root account. The root account is essentially the administrator account with the highest privileges. So at the moment, we don't have root privileges under this user. And the reason for that change was very simply a security improvement that is going to limit our ability to run certain commands. It's going to slow us down and basically help us to think before we perform an action. When we try to perform restricted actions, we're going to be prompted with an error, letting us know that we do not have root permission by default. In order to do that, in order to obtain root permission, we need to elevate our permission using the sudo command. Sudo being short for super user do. So when we want to do something as a super user or as a root user or as an administrator if you like, we preface these commands with the sudo keyword. This essentially tells the operating system that we want to run the command as root. So let's say we try to do something that a typical administrator might do, like create a new user. If we use the command add user followed by the username, I'll just make that John in this case. Notice when I hit enter, we're going to see an error message. We're told that only root users may add a user or group to the system. And this is expected because in order to write passwords into the password directory, in order to write users and new groups into the directory, we need root access. We need a higher permission level. Now, if we actually preface that with the sudo command, we're allowed to do that. So let's say sudo add user John. If I hit enter with this command, you can see that we did add the user successfully. We created a new group, we created a new home directory as well. It's asking us to set a password for this user. So I'll enter that and I'll enter it again just to confirm, and lots of other information that is going to prompt us for. If you want to put those types of things, it's fine. But here, I'm just going to hit enter and default through all of those. And once that's completed, we're all set. We're able to do that using the sudo prefix before the add user command. This sudo command is also necessary to view sensitive files, such as the etc shadow file. This is a text file that contains information about the system users and passwords. Another command that I will show you here is called cat, and that's short for concatenate. This is simply a way that we can display the contents of a file without the need to actually open that file in a text editor. So let's say cat, then we're going to point to the directory sc/shadow. If I hit enter, notice that we get a permission denied error. So we've got a problem once again where we need super user do privileges. If we arrow up, by the way, hitting your up arrow is going to let you cycle through your previous commands. You can see that if I arrow up, it's going to cycle through all the commands I previously ran. So that's a shortcut to be aware of, a really helpful shortcut. I can arrow up, I can go to the beginning of the output here, and I can preface that with a sudo. When I do that, then now we're actually able to see that shadow file. And down here at the bottom, we're going to see our users. We see the current user that we are using, which is Kali, and we see the user John that we just created. Now, as I said, in previous versions, you could get right into the root account by way of the default login. That was removed from Kali Linux. But there's a way that you can do that from the command line and run that in root for a single terminal instance. So let's go ahead here and say sudo. Actually, let me go ahead and clear this off. When your terminal gets really full, you can simply type the word clear and hit enter, and it's going to clear that out for you. That's also a really nice command to make sure you're getting everything straight. So let's say sudo, once again, the command we want next is su, that stands for switch user, followed by a dash, then we hit enter. Notice that we have this message from the Kali developers, and our terminal has now changed into the root user. You can see that highlighted. We also have this little skull icon in the terminal output, which I find very hilarious, and which of course indicates you're now in for serious business. Now from the root account, we can drop the sudo command. We don't have to preface our commands with sudo anymore. So if I say cat etc/shadow once again, and I hit enter, notice that I didn't need the sudo command any longer. It immediately allowed me to do that. Now remember, I said this only works for a single instance of the terminal emulator. If you do create a new tab, which is a common habit for me, I frequently work from multiple tabs. Notice that when I open that new tab, we are back to the Kali user. Our original tab is still in root, but the new tab defaults back to our original user, our logged in user, which is Kali. So this root instance is only good for the single instance in our terminal emulator. The big takeaway here is, if you're trying to run a command from an account, such as the default Kali account or any other account you've created, and you're getting some sort of strange error message, or you're seeing an error based around permissions or denial of access, the first thing you should try to do is run the sudo command in front of that. That's going to allow you to access restricted files and restricted operations. Another important skill is navigating the Linux file system. This is a little different than using a graphical user interface such as you might see in Mac OS or Windows. In those operating systems, we are browsing through folder structures using a graphical user interface or a GUI. We can also do that in Kali, as we've seen, by browsing to our home folder here, that's pinned in our top menu. But the preferred way that you should be learning to do that, and the most efficient way, is actually from the terminal emulator. One of the first things to know is how to tell where you are currently at in the file structure. And we can do that with the command pwd. That's short for print working directory, which will basically print, or in other words, display the current directory which you are under. If I do that and I hit enter, you can see that my current working directory is home/Kali. So that is the directory for the regular user Kali. Now, if we want to change our current directory, how can we do that? Well, if you're familiar with the Windows command line at all, it's actually the same command. We use the command cd, which is short for change directory. If you're trying to run a command in Windows outside of the target directory, and you haven't specified that part in the command, that command won't work in Windows. So you might be familiar with the concept of changing into a different working directory inside of Windows before you actually run a command. That's a similar concept like what we're seeing here. So we can say cd to change the directory, but where do we go? How do we know what's available to us? Well, we can actually use the list command. Let me delete that. And to use the list command, we say ls for short, and we hit enter. And that is going to list the current contents of the directory that we're working inside of, which is of course our user's home directory. So let's say we want to change into the pictures directory that we see here. By the way, I'll also point out that there are colors that indicate what we're looking at. You'll notice that all of these outputs are listed in blue. That's because these are all other directories. You may see other colors as well. Things like executable files or graphic files, that will be different colors. And let's in fact go inside of our pictures folder, and we'll do a list command inside there. So let's say cd pictures to change into that folder. You can see that now. We're told we're inside of there. If we say pwd to print our current working directory, that confirms we're in the pictures directory. If we say ls from here to get the list, you'll see that there's an image file in there named mountain, which is color coded in purple. So there are all kinds of different color coding options inside of Linux that indicate what type of files you're looking at. You can do a quick Google search to find out all of those color coding options, which are actually quite numerous. This is however not a requirement, but it's definitely a useful information. Now, we can go all the way back to the very root of our file structure at any time by saying cd /. If we do that and hit enter and then we say ls, you'll notice our home folder listed here that we're currently inside of. So if we say cd /home and do an ls, this is going to list the users on this system. One of those being Kali, the user folder that we were previously working inside of. Now let's go all the way back to our main root folder. I'm going to use the clear command to clear this off. I'll do pwd first, just to print our current working directory. You see that we are at the very root level of our structure. Now, if I say ls home/Kali, it will list the contents of that folder. We see all of these subdirectories that we previously looked at, even though we're not currently inside of that directory. That can be very helpful for navigating as well. Another shortcut that's helpful is the tab key on your keyboard. This is going to help autocomplete what you're trying to type in order to save time. If I say cd /h, watch what happens when I hit tab. It's going to autocomplete the word home and put a /. If I do the letter K and hit tab, it's going to do the same thing for Kali. Now, what happens if I do the letter D? Notice we have 3 different directories beginning with the letter D. What's going to happen when I hit tab? How is it going to know what I'm wanting to autocomplete? Well, let's watch and see what happens. When I hit tab, it's actually going to give me some suggestions. You'll see it lets me know all of my available options: desktop, documents, and downloads. So again, very, very helpful when you're running commands to know which options are available at your disposal. If I add an O to that and do the same thing, it's going to narrow down those results to only two, which are documents and downloads. Just a helpful tip to help you speed up things a little bit. Let's change into the desktop directory actually. I will go up to my previous comment and I will say home/kali/desktop. Now let's talk about making a new directory. We can make a completely new file structure for my terminal as well. And that command is mkdir. That's short for make directory. So we'll say mkdir, we'll call that test, and we'll hit enter. Now, if we actually minimize this terminal for a moment, notice that on our desktop, we do have a test folder directory that was created. Quite simple. If we say ls for lists, you see the directory, the text directory that we just created from here as well. Likewise, we can remove that directory with a command mdir. You may have figured that already. That's short for remove directory. And we'll say test, and that will remove that. If we say ls, it doesn't come up with any results here in the terminal. And if we minimize, now we see that directory is in fact missing from our desktop. We'll dive more into some of these other commands later. But for the time being, I just want you to know about the file structure and navigation. Another thing in regard to that is the locate file feature. Let me change back into the lowest level directory. I'm going to clear off our terminal just so that things are less confusing. And let's use the command locate followed by the name of a file that we want to locate. I'm going to use mountain. You might have noticed earlier that there was a file named mountain.jpg inside of our pictures folder. So when I hit enter here, it's going to show me every directory where there's a file reference with the word mountain in it. There happens to be 3 in this case. The one I'm looking for is located at home/kali/pictures, and we see mountain.jpg inside of there. I would also like to mention a common issue that users face while using the locate command. If you have recently added a file and for some reason you can't find it using the locate command, you can simply issue the update db command to refresh and populate the directories. Then you can reissue the locate and file name command to perform your search again. One last thing I'll touch on in regard to file system navigation is the help feature called Linux manual pages. For many commands, not all commands, but for many available commands, you have built-in manual pages explaining how to use the commands and other optional parameters that you can use. For example, if we say man, which is short for manual, and we use any command that is available with a manual, let's use the list command. So we'll say man ls, we will hit enter, and from here we'll see the name, the synopsis, the function, and some optional arguments for that command. That's a great way to learn more about certain commands and to learn other optional parameters. You can hit the enter key, as I'm doing here, to continue to scroll down through a manual document. You can jump page by page with the space bar, and once you're finished, you'll see at the bottom, it tells us that we can hit the Q key to quit. When I do that, it takes me right back into my regular terminal. So let's use one of these optional parameters that we saw. Let's change directory back to home/kali/pictures. I'll hit enter, and let's say ls-s. This should display the file size. When I hit enter, you'll see that in fact, we do see the file size for mountain.jpg. And if there were numerous files inside of this directory structure, we would have all of those files listed along with the file size for each one. Now we want to talk about file permissions inside of Kali Linux. And as we just looked at, let's start with taking a look at the manual for the ls command. If you remember, that was man ls. That's going to display the help manual for the list command. I'm going to spacebar through some of these options to show you something specifically. One of those is -l. That means we're going to use a long listing format. One of the ones at the top of this document was -a as well. If we scroll back up, you'll see that -a says, do not ignore entries starting with a period. Any file starting with a period is a hidden file. So those are the 2 parameters that I want to use with my list command. I'm going to hit Q to quit. I'm going to clear off my terminal, and I'm going to say ls-la. Now, we could say ls-l-a. But one thing that you notice is anytime you're using these optional parameters that start with a dash, you can combine those and you can just use only a single dash just to make things easier. So before I do that, I'm just going to show you the simple ls output that we see here. And now if I say ls-la, you'll see we have a little bit different output, right? We have a couple of different files here that start with a period. So the -a optional parameter said, I want to see those hidden files. And the -l parameter gave me that long format. So we have much more information here. But what are we looking at? Well, let's break this down, because this is going to give us information about file permissions. Let's start with this strange jumble of numbers that's up front. We're always going to see 10 characters represented here. That breaks down into 4 distinct parts. The first part is the first letter to the left. Anything that is a directory is going to begin with the letter D, as these 2 hidden directories do. Anything that is a file is going to begin with a dash. Now, we might also see a file beginning with a lowercase l. Those are simply what we refer to as symlink or soft links. Those symlink are files that simply point to another location on the system. So you could think of those as almost like a shortcut. Let's stick with this JPEG file, the mountain.jpg, that starts with a dash. And so that means that this is a regular file. That leaves our 9 other characters, and those are split into 3 different sections, each one containing 3 characters. We have a section of 3 here, a section of 3 here, and another section of 3 here. Let's start with this first section, which is RW-. This first group of 3 shows permissions for the user or the file owner. The next group of 3 shows permissions for the group to which this user belongs. So any other user in that group would have these permissions, and the final group of 3 will be for every other user on the system. Users that don't own the file or that might be outside of the user group. So again, if you look at the example above that, these are the options that we will have, R, W, and X. And we may also optionally have a dash in one of those, as we see here, where the W and X have been replaced. R stands for read permission, W stands for write permission, and X is for execute permission. Let's actually go back to home/Kali. We'll do a list here. I'm going to clear that off. I'm going to do ls-la to see this list. So again, we are seeing hidden files here. We're seeing directories such as our desktop. Let's take this desktop directory as an example that starts with a D because it is a directory. The next 3 letters here are RWX. So these are the permissions for us as the owner of this directory. So we have R, W, and X present. That means that we can read, write, or execute this directory. The next sets are for any other users that might be in our same user group on this system. And notice that that is R-X, so the W is missing. So that means that anybody else who is in our same user group, they can read from the desktop directory. They can execute from the desktop directory, but they cannot write to that because the W is missing. Similarly, any other users on the system who are not us or who are outside of that user group have the same permissions. They can only read or execute from the desktop directory. So anytime you see dashes, that indicates that a specific permission is not granted. That permission being either read, write, or execute. Whichever one of those permissions are not granted, you're going to see a dash in its place. Now, notice the 2 names listed here beside that as well. We have Kali. The first name is going to be the actual username. The second name is the group name for this user. And by default, Kali will create the same group name for a user. If you remember in a previous video, we created a user named John, and it automatically set that user to a user group named John as well. So by default, user accounts are set up with user and group names that are the same. But now we can, of course, sort and change those and reorganize those if necessary. Let's now talk about how we can change file permissions as well. To do that, let's go ahead and create a new file. Let me clear off our display, and I'm going to create a new file using a command called touch. That's just a really simple command that will create an empty file followed by a file name. I'll make that test.txt. I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to say ls-la once again, and we should see our test file here. And in fact, we do. We see our text.txt file listed here. And just to make this a little bit less confusing, I'm going to clear this off once again. And I want to say ls-l. That's not going to display those hidden files. So it's going to make this list a little bit smaller, as you can see, hopefully a little bit less confusing. But again, you notice that this test text file we created starts with a dash because it is a normal file. We have read and write permissions. We do not have execute permissions because this is not an executable file. Any other user in our group can read that. Any other user outside of our group can also only read that. Now we can also alter file permissions with a command called chmod. That's short for change mode. And there are a few options here, but the really relevant option for us as pen testers is the command chmod 777 followed by the file name, which in our case is test.txt. So once I do that, I'm going to hit enter. And once again, we'll list the files again with ls.l. We can do that by arrowing up to our previous command. When I do that, you can see that the file permissions have now changed. Again, our color coding, this green color coding is telling us we have full permissions. Notice this is full now, rwx, rwx, rwx. That has given complete permission to all users. So again, that's the really relevant chmod command that you really need to know, because that's going to be very helpful if you're trying to access certain restricted files or give complete permission to certain users. There are certainly other permission levels that you can use by different number combinations. Those aren't necessarily relevant to this particular course, but if you're interested, you can definitely find those with a quick Google search and find an explanation of how those numbers work to give or take away permissions.